Hi and welcome to our third video on Reason Remote MIDI maps. Today we will talk about the remote groups and the special group, keyboard shortcut variations. Often you will find your MIDI control surface has only a limited number of physical pots, faders or buttons, and the Reason device has many more controls than you have available. This is where remote groups come in. The idea is you can have each physical control do a different thing for each group it is assigned in, a little like MIDI controller presets found on some control surfaces. To help explain this, let's say you have a MIDI controller that has 8 faders and you want to map all 14 channels of the 14 to mixer device in Reason. You also want control of the master mixer fader. To do this, you can define a group all times states. Let's call the group channels and the two possible states 1 to 7 and the other 8 to 14. This is wrote in your remote map file below the scope line for the 14 to mixer and before your map entry lines. The line starts with the words, define group, followed by one tab, then your group name, channels and another tab. After this you put each possible group value separated by a tab character, as shown here. Then you put your map entry lines, like we did in a previous video. With the exception of the Reason device items we want restricted to a specific group, we add 3 tabs after the remittable item and then the group value. So for example, the mixer level 1 for channel 1 would have the group value 1 to 7 added, whereas the mixer level 8 for channel 8 would have the group value 8 to 14 added. See here, where all 14 channels have been mapped. Note the control surface items are repeated in each group, so that our first fader will control either mixer level channel 1 or mixer level channel 8. Also note the master mixer level shown here does not have any group value added. This means that our 8th fader will always control the master level regardless of what our channel group is set to. Now if we just use the above remote map, it won't work, as we have not set any control to change the group value. Let's say we don't have any buttons on our MIDI control surface that we can use. Well, this is where the special keyboard shortcut variations option comes in. This option allows you to use your computer keyboard to select one of a possible 10 group values. You do this by pressing Command plus Option for Mac or Control plus Alt for Windows, together with the number 1 through 0 on the top row of keys, to select a group value 1 through 10. It defaults to the first group value, number 1, and they will have no effect if no group value is set for the number you select. So if you only have 2 possible group values set and you select number 3, nothing will happen. So how can we update our remote map to use these keyboard shortcut variations? Well, it is quite easy. Just replace the group name, channels, with keyboard shortcut variations. Let's say we do have 2 buttons on our control surface we can use to select the group value. How can we map them? Well, you add a new map entry starting the same as before, with a map, a single tab followed by the button control item name and then 2 tabs. After this you put the group name, which in our previous example was channels, followed by an equal sign and then the group value you want this button to select. You can see the 2 group buttons mapped here together with all the fader remittable controls for the 14 to mixer. So what happens if you want to have best of both and have the option to use either buttons on your control surface or keys on your computer keyboard? Again, this is easily done by changing the group name from channels to keyboard shortcut variations. This needs to be changed on both the define group line and the map entry lines. You can see this change here on screen. Note the group name is changed in all places it was used. Let's say we have the same controller with 8 faders and 2 buttons, but we have a rack extension that has 80 remittable items we wish to control. We want the best of both with computer keyboard shortcuts and buttons on our controller, but we only have 2 buttons. Well, this can still be done if we set up 10 possible group values on the define group line and set the group name to keyboard shortcut variations. We map all the remittable items to our 8 faders across the 10 possible groups, like before, by adding the group value at the end of each map entry. But how do we select from the 10 possible group values with only 2 buttons? We can add map entries for each button, selecting a different group value based on the currently selected group value. This will make the 2 buttons act as previous and next group buttons. To do this, let's start with button 2 as our next group button and add a new map entry like before, setting the group value to the second group, but this time add the 3 tabs and the first group value at the end. We do this as we only want the next button to select group 2 if we are currently in group 1. We repeat this process for each group, so the next map entry will select group 3 and have group 2 added at the end. If you want the next group button to wrap around from group 10 back to group 1, and a map entry to select group 1 with a group 10 at the end, see the last entry in the example on screen. We then repeat this process for the previous group button, but remember it is in reverse. So if we start with setting the group to 9 with a group 10 added at the end, then setting to group 8 with group 9 added at the end, and so on. Again, if you want the previous group button to wrap around from group 1 to group 10, and an entry that selects group 10 with a group 1 added at the end, here is an example of how it may look. Remember, the possible group names and values can be set to any 7-bit ASCII text. It doesn't have to be labeled as group 1 to group 10 as shown here. If you would like to get even more advanced with groups, you can define more than one group, but please note, there is only one keyboard shortcut variations group with a maximum of 10 possible group values. If you decide to use multiple defined groups, remember you will need buttons or controls on your MIDI control surface to switch between the possible values. Also, all the group names and all possible group values must be unique, so you can't have any two group names the same or any two group values the same even if defined in different groups. However, you are not limited to 10 possible group values when defining groups other than the keyboard shortcut variations group. Here is a simple example of a remote map that has two defined groups. Note, on the map entry lines you can specify a group option value from each defined group, each separated by one tab character. The map is for the line 6, 2 mixer, and there is one group that selects either volume and pan or volume and FX send. The other group switches between flipped or not flipped, switching which MIDI control works the volume. There are 4 buttons that select which option from the two groups are active. It can get quite complex when working with groups, not only when creating your remote maps but also when using your controller. If your controller supports MIDI feedback like LCD text or LED lights, you may be able to include this in your maps to help let you know which MIDI group you are currently using. One last note about group names and their option values: there isn't any restriction for their length, but all characters used must be 7-bit ASCII. Here is a table showing the full 7-bit ASCII character set. Using any character outside this set will result in an error in your remote map. Also remember, groups are defined separately for each device scope, so you could have only one group defined for the Mixer 14.2 but have several defined groups for the Europa synthesizer, and you can use the same group names and option values across different scopes. They'd only need be unique within a single device scope. My advice when using remote groups is to document your settings, so you have a reference to what MIDI control does which remote action for each available group. This becomes especially helpful when working with many devices, each having many groups. And lastly, if your remote codec or MIDI control surface doesn't have motorized faders for endless encoders or no MIDI soft takeover feature, when switching between remote groups, you may experience value jumps. This is because the physical setting of a fader pot may be different to the current value of the remote item in Reason. With motorized faders and endless encoders, either the control is automatically set to match the current remote item value like the fader moving, or the MIDI data sent represents a +1 or -1 relative value instead of a fixed value between 0 and 127. With soft takeover features, this can either be a feature of your MIDI controller or a feature of your remote codec. In either case, the idea is when the physical MIDI control value doesn't match the Reason remote item value, no MIDI data is sent to Reason until the value first matches. So if your fader is set to 0 but the remote item value is set to 40, when you move the fader up, no MIDI data is sent to Reason until your fader reaches 40. Then moving the fader up or down will send the data to Reason and change the remote item value. This works best with controllers that indicate the difference in values, so you can see where you need to move the physical control to, so that the values match. I hope you found this tutorial helpful. Using remote groups can really extend the possibilities of remote control you have over the devices in your rack via your MIDI control surface, even with a very limited number of physical controls. In our next tutorial we cover how to map keys on your MIDI keyboard to trigger remote items in your Reason rack. Till then, please let us know if you have any questions, and remember, subscribe with the red button below to get news of new videos.